Hi, so it's been a while since I read chapter 4 and recorded chapter 4, so I just had to remind myself. So, Nubia is going to learn Latin and she's vanished. So let's find out where she is in chapter 5. So, scroll 5, chapter 5. Oh no, I knew it'd be all too much for her, cried Flavia. She only came out of the slave ship this morning. Don't worry, said Mordecai. Perhaps the food was too rich for her. She may be in the latrine. But when Flavia reported that Nubia wasn't there, they all began to worry and decided to search the house. Still wearing their party garlands, Mordecai and Flavia's father looked downstairs, while Jonathan, Miriam and Flavia searched the upstairs bedrooms. The doorkeeper, Caddo, dozing in the atrium, swore that no one had gone out. Alma, scrubbing plates in the kitchen, had the door constantly in her line of sight. She was sure Nubia had not gone near it. When they had searched the whole house, they met in the atrium by the household shrine. Before we begin the search outside, said Flavia's father, gravely removing his garland. Have we checked every room? Yes, said the children. Yes, nodded Mordecai. No, said Caddo, slowly scratching his armpit. They all gazed at the big slave. Scutto is still shut up in the storeroom, he mumbled. He was whining and scratching to be let out, but... Yes, they cried. Then he went very quiet. They all hurried to the storeroom and cautiously Captain Geminus opened the door. By now it was dusk, and the storeroom, which had no windows, was dim and shadowy. They could just make out the shapes of dozens of storage jars full of wine and grain, half buried in the sandy earth to keep them from toppling over. I think I see him, said Flavia's father. Bring a lamp. Alma rushed to hand him a clay oil lamp, and the captain stepped into the storeroom. Great Neptune's beard, he exclaimed softly. In the golden lamplight they saw Nubia and Scutto curled up asleep on the sandy floor. The girl's dark head rested on the dog's broad woolly back. She had placed the flowered garland on his head. As they all crowded in the doorway, Scutto raised his big head with the garland slightly askew. He looked at them drowsily, sighed deeply, and went back to sleep. One bright afternoon a few days later, Flavia's new friend accompanied her to the river harbour to see her father off on a voyage. Dr. Mordecai and Captain Geminus led the way. They looked an unlikely pair, Flavia thought as she watched them walking and talking together. Her fair-headed Roman father in his tunic and blue cloak, the doctor with his exotic turban, robe and beard. But they had a common passion, travel. Mordecai had lived in Babylon and Jerusalem, two cities her father had never visited, and Captain Geminus had seen many countries, which Mordecai had only read about. Flavia was glad they liked each other, because in only a few days she and Jonathan had also become firm friends. Jonathan had been coming to her house every morning to help teach Nubia Latin. He and Flavia had been reading the Aeneid to her, often stopping to explain or act out words. Jonathan was very funny and made them both laugh. Flavia thought it was good for Nubia to laugh. Now as they made their way towards the river Tiber, Nubia was walking between Flavia and Jonathan, holding Scutto's lead. Since the night of the dinner party, the slave girl and the dog had been inseparable. She even refused to sleep in the new bed they'd brought up to Flavia's room. Instead, Nubia curled up every night in the garden with Scutto and slept under the stars. Also walking with them to the docks was her father's patron, Titus Claudius Atticus, who had chartered her father's ship for a 2-week voyage to Greece. He intended to visit the town of Corinth to buy pottery, perfume and bronzes. Claudius was a very wealthy merchant who lived opposite them in one of the largest and most beautiful houses in Ostia. He also had a townhouse in Rome and an estate in Sicily. But despite his wealth, he always seemed very sad. Flavia's father had once told her the reason. Or Claudius had been serving as an officer in Gemini. His whole family had been slaughtered by barbarians. A lovely wife, 3 fine young sons and a baby girl, now all gone to the underworld and no one to leave his great riches to. Claudius doesn't need to work as a merchant, her father had said. But since he lost his family, there is a deep restlessness in him. I think he travels to get away from his empty house. All the wealth in the world is no good if you don't have a family. Her father had hugged her tightly. Recently, however, Claudius had seemed more cheerful. Sometimes his stern face even relaxed into a smile. Flavia knew why, but she'd been sworn to secrecy. Claudius had considered adopting his young freedman, Libertus. She had overheard the rich merchant discussing it with her father. You mustn't tell a soul, Flavia's father had warned her. He is still thinking about it and no one knows, not even Libertus. Previously a slave in Claudius's household, Libertus had shown such skill and promise that he had been set free. Now a freed man, he still lived and worked in his patron's house, but was paid for it. Flavia considered that Libertus would make some girl a fine husband. He had straight black hair, clear skin, and dark blue eyes. He was young, intelligent, and charming. Furthermore, if Claudius adopted Libertus, one day he would be incredibly rich. And so Flavia was delighted to see Libertus walking beside Jonathan's sister Miriam. She thought they made a dazzling couple and wondered if the young freedman was telling Miriam that her eyes were like amethyst and her skin like alabaster. Then she heard him say something about slavery in Judea and sighed. Libertus was definitely not wooing Miriam. As they emerged from between 2 warehouses and stepped onto the quayside, Flavia took a deep breath of the salty air. Seagulls and swifts soared and swooped above the river. Sailors and dockers rolled barrels and wine jars. Slaves loaded crates on carts, and soldiers marched past. And this was the quietest time of day. The harbour always made Flavia feel both excited and sad. Excited because every ship promised a new adventure. Sad because her father so often went away. The sight of her father's small ship, the Myrtilla, also made Flavia sad. Myrtilla had been the name of her mother, who had died in childbirth when Flavia was only 3 years old. The twin baby boys had died too. Flavia left alone with only her father and Nurse Alma. As they approached the Myrtilla's birth, 3 burly Phoenician brothers shouted their greetings from various parts of the ship. They were called Quartus, Quintus, and Sextus. The 4th crew member was an Ethiopian named Ebnus. His oiled, cheerful face rose up from the hold when he heard the others. Her father and the merchant Claudius had already stowed their belongings on board the ship. They had visited the temple of Castor and Pollux to make sacrifice for a good and profitable journey. Now the wind was favourable and it was time for them to depart. Captain Geminus bounded up the boarding plank to make some last-minute checks aboard the ship. While Claudius gave Libertus some final instructions, Flavia was disappointed to see the handsome freed man hurry home shortly afterwards. She noticed Miriam watching Libertus until he was out of sight. Suddenly, Flavia noticed that Nubia began to tremble uncontrollably. The docks obviously upset her. The slave girl hugged Scutto for reassurance, and his wet kisses seemed to calm her. A few moments later, Captain Geminus came down the boarding plank and put one arm around Flavia's shoulder. "Time for me to go," he said with a smile, and then added gravely, "You know, I'm a little worried about your safety since that incident with the dogs. Your tutor isn't here to look out for you this month. Cado can be terribly slow, and I don't know what Alma would do to protect you against a pack of wild dogs. or even kidnappers. Don't worry, Pater, I'm not alone. Dr. Mordecai lives next door, and I have Jonathan and Nubia to keep me company now. And the Scutto. Ah, yes, the fierce watchdog. They looked down at Scutto, who was lathering Nubia's face with his wet tongue. Smiling, Captain Geminus shook his head. Well, if I hear you've been in the least danger, I'm packing you off to my brothers the next time I go on voyage. Don't worry, Pater. Jonathan and I will sit quietly in the garden all day and take turns reading the Aeneid to Nubia. We're teaching her Latin. She pulled Nubia close and put a protective arm around her. Good, good. Flavia's father quickly kissed her on the top of her head, said goodbye to the rest of them, and then he and Claudius boarded the ship. Using oars, the crew soon manoeuvred the small ship out of her berth and into the river channel. As a swift current carried the Myrtle down towards the river mouth, Flavia's father stood at the helm, holding the steering paddle. Although Flavia usually stayed to watch until the Myrtle passed right out of sight, Nubia was trembling again. So Flavia decided to take her home quickly. Her father was busy at the helm, but just before they started back, Flavia saw him turn and wave one last time. It was still early afternoon when they returned to Green Fountain Street. Theirs was one of the few quiet residential streets in the bustling town, and now at the hottest time of the day it was almost deserted. Only Liberta stood at the communal fountain in the middle of the crossroads. They waved as they walked past, and Flavia noticed Miriam give him a shy smile. As soon as they left the docks, Nubia had stopped trembling. Now Jonathan was walking beside her and teaching her words in Latin by pointing at objects and saying their name. Door, he said. Door, she repeated. Lion, he indicated a bronze door knocker. Lion. Curb. Curb. Fountain. Fountain. Water? Yes, water. Good, encouraged Jonathan. Street. Street. Don't step in that. Don't step. Well, that looks like horse dung, but people empty their chamber pots here and it's pretty wet, so I think we'd better go back to the pavement. Nubia looked to him solemnly. Pavement, said Jonathan. Pavement? Repeated Nubia. And what's this? Blood? Blood, said Nubia, and pointed at the trail of drops that led to Jonathan's front door. So, just to warn you, the next chapter coming up is a little bit more gruesome and there is a little bit more blood, but I will be recording that soon, and I hope you enjoy chapter 5, and I hope you enjoy chapter 6 coming up.